A common theme you'll find being a horror fan, especially one that's a content creator, is that most people revere the 1980s as the greatest era of horror films. So, having said that, let's go through the decade and pick out the best horror movie from each year of the 1980s. What's up, you guys? Nick here from the Lost River Drive-In, and you guys have really seemed to like this little series I've just started, which is going through each decade and finding my favorite horror movie in each year of said decade. So I thought, why not go to the golden era? Why not go to the decade that everybody reveres as the best? And that's the 1980s. Now, I have to say right off the top, guys, these are my favorite from every year in the decade. I'm not saying that they are the best from each year, though if there is one that I will, argue is, I will say so. But I want to hear down below what your guys' favorites are from each year too. So starting it off with 1980, which was a very strong year in horror in my opinion, it goes to John Carpenter's The Fog. Now a lot of people, most people, when they think about John Carpenter, they think about Halloween and they think about The Thing. Those are the two movies most people go to. And while I love both of those movies, obviously, The Fog is incredible. The Fog is a movie that I feel like just gets lost in the shuffle a lot of times because the 80s was such a huge year in horror and John Carpenter had two great films sandwiched in between The Fog. So you almost don't hear about it that much. But I think The Fog is a really effective ghost story. It's creepy, it's got great music, it's got great actors in this movie. Jamie Lee Curtis, Tom Atkins, Adrienne Barbeau. Go down the list. The movie is just loaded from front to back, I think, and everything you could want in a horror movie from the 1980s, this movie has it. So while I understand why everybody always gravitates towards The Thing and Halloween, I will always maintain that this movie is super underappreciated, and it is probably, if not definitely, my favorite horror movie of 1980. Next up is 1981, and 1981 was not as strong of a year in horror, but there were some standouts. I want to give a special shout out to Halloween 2 and The Funhouse, two movies that I love, but they were not my favorite of this year. My favorite of 1981 is The Evil Dead. Now, you guys know, if you know my channel and you know me at all, I'm a huge fan of the Evil Dead series. And the original Evil Dead is probably my least favorite in the series, which, shocker, I know, right? But it is a near perfect series to me. There's every movie I think is damn near 5 out of 5, and The Evil Dead is no exception to that. This movie is still effective and creepy. There's something about this movie, the low budget nature and the kind of grindhouse presentation of it makes it last, it makes it seem so authentic even to this day, to where like it actually kind of does seem like people were getting possessed and killing each other in this cabin in the woods. And so I'm, stumbling a little bit trying to piece together what I'm trying to say, but you guys know what I mean. The Evil Dead obviously started a franchise that became a really big deal for a lot of horror fans. I'd say it's still kind of niche to the casual moviegoer, but I think to a lot of us horror fans, The Evil Dead is an absolute banger and one that we're going to love and revere forever. So I gotta go The Evil Dead with 1981. As an Evil Dead fan, and a year that wasn't super strong, it's gonna go to that one. Now, 1982 was a different story. This was a great year in horror. So I've got to give a shout out to Halloween 3 Season of the Witch, Friday the 13th Part 3, and John Carpenter's The Thing. But none of those were my favorite movie of 1982. No, my favorite movie of 1982 was Poltergeist, and still is Poltergeist. Look, Poltergeist is one of the few movies that still freaks me out as an adult. There's just something about the movie that gets under my skin. There's multiple scenes that, even though for today's standards it's kind of tame in a lot of ways, it didn't seem tame to me as a kid watching it. And because of that, when I watch it now, I almost watch it through the lens that I did when I was younger, how it made me feel and how it resonated with me. This is one of the best, if not the best, supernatural spooky ghost movies there is. Poltergeist is an all-timer, and although I love so many movies in this year, I've got to give it to Poltergeist because it scarred me for life. Now we've reached 1983, which doesn't have as deep of a roster when it comes to quality horror movies, but there's a few that stand out. So shout-outs go to Sleepaway Camp, Cujo, and Christine. But my favorite movie of 1983 has got to be Psycho 2. Now, this might surprise some of you guys, and I'm sure there's a lot of horror fans that have only seen the original Psycho and probably wrote off all the other sequels because, they happened decades later. They must be terrible. No, Psycho 2 is actually awesome. The thing about Psycho 2 that I like so much is, and some days I like it better than the original, it flips the entire persona of Norman Bates on its head. It makes the viewer go from Norman Bates was this terrible person to almost this sympathetic anti-hero in a way. You're rooting for him. And if a movie can do that with such a terrible person and do it successfully, the movie already gets high marks from me and should from any person watching the movie. Although this movie came out 2 decades later, it's a great movie. It is genuinely a great movie, and I don't hear enough people talk about it. Psycho as a series really is not one that people talk about enough. They talk about the original because, oh, it's Psycho, it's a classic, right? But there's some great movies in this series. I would also say Psycho 4 is a great movie. But alas, we'll stop it at 1983 with Psycho 2. Now, 1984 saw the release of most people's favorite Friday the 13th film, Friday the 13th, The Final Chapter. It also saw the release of Children of the Corn, but neither one of those movies are the one I chose for this year. The one I chose is A Nightmare on Elm Street. Now, A Nightmare on Elm Street is not my favorite Nightmare on Elm Street movie, so, I mean, you're probably already like, what? But I've always been more of a Freddy guy than a Jason guy. And I remember being young and what A Nightmare on Elm Street did to me, watching that movie as young as I did, which, no, I'll never defend my mother for showing me some of these movies at the age she did. I was far too young. But those kind of memories burn into your brain and they make you have a fondness for certain characters and certain movies. And this is one of those movies, and Freddy Krueger is one of those characters. Although Michael Myers is my guy, Freddy is a close second, and this movie is genuinely a great movie that spawned a great, iconic horror franchise that we're still talking about today and wondering where the hell it is. So, although there were some great movies in this year, A Nightmare on Elm Street for me is just it's going to take the cake. Now, 1985 was a very deep year in horror. You had Friday the 13th Part 5, which is great in my opinion. I love that movie. Silver Bullet, House, you name it. A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2, Freddy's Revenge, which is my favorite Nightmare on Elm Street movie, right? So I'm going to be redundant and pick that one for 1985. I'm actually not. I'm going to pick Fright Night for the same reasons that I picked A Nightmare on Elm Street previously. This is a movie that meant a ton to me in my childhood. It's probably my favorite vampire movie of all time, right there neck and neck with The Lost Boys. It's a movie that, I mean, I just remember Evil Ed. I remember the makeup effects. I remember the music. I remember the poster, that ghostly poster. There's so much about this movie. It is the role that I think about when it comes to Chris Sarandon. It's always Jerry Dandridge. Fright Night is a movie that is so 80s, it could never be separated from that time. And to some movies, that'll make a movie age poorly, but this is not one of those movies. I think this movie transports you back to that era in a loving way, and I'm always going to pop that movie in when I need a dose of nostalgia and remembering when times were simpler. So Fright Night in 1985, it's got to be my favorite. If I had to argue like the best, I'd probably say Freddy's Revenge, but I'm not going to quibble here. Fright Night's my favorite. Now, 1986 was a much simpler year for me. It was a very easy decision, and that is The Fly. Now, that's not to say that there aren't good movies in 1986, and there are, but, I mean, The Fly stands out above the rest. The effects in this movie are still, to this day, gross. I mean, just the body horror that is The Fly is enough to put this movie over the top of anything else that came out this year. And I'm a big fan of Maximum Overdrive, and I'm actually an apologist of Poltergeist too. But, like, I'm kidding myself if I say The Fly isn't it, because I'll argue The Fly is one of the best remakes ever, if not the best. So that being the case, then just how nightmarishly disgusting this movie is, even in a 2024 mindset, it's got to be The Fly. So I'm not even going to expand upon it any more than that. I'd love to hear if you guys disagree, but it's The Fly for me in 1986. Now, for 1987, most people are probably going to immediately assume or gravitate towards Dream Warriors, and rightfully so. Or Hellraiser. But if you know anything about me, you know we're not there yet when it comes to Hellraiser. So 1987 is going to be The Lost Boys. Look, I'll never look at White Rice the same way again. I mean, it is something that has been ruined for me because of this movie. And I'm not even exaggerating. This was one of my mom's favorite movies. And growing up, we watched this movie all the time as a family. I mean, the music in this movie will live rent-free in my head forever. This is where I was introduced to Kiefer Sutherland. This was the first time where, in my experience, we saw a vampire movie that they were really trying to lean into the fact that these vampires are cool and edgy and sexy and dangerous. And like, that was an interesting tact because up to that point for me, I had always viewed vampires as just like purely scary, like old timey black and white. And this was a very different take on vampires. And we've seen it done a lot more since then in that way. But this was that introduction for me. Look, the movie's fun, the movie's exciting, the movie's funny. It's incredibly memorable from its performances to its music to its set. I mean, it's great. So The Lost Boys, 1987, hands down, without question. Now we've reached 1988, and a lot of people probably gravitate towards Child's Play or Halloween 4 or Killer Clowns from Outer Space or The Dream Master, all of which are great movies, and this was a great year. But nah, it's Hellbound Hellraiser 2 for me, and this is arguably number one for the 80s for me, period. I think Hellbound Hellraiser 2 is everything the first movie did better. You get all of the gross, disgusting, nightmarish, kinky shit from the first Hellraiser turned up to 11, while also getting to finally look at the Labyrinth and Leviathan and really getting into like the Harryhausen stop motion type stuff that I loved. Not exactly, but that's what my mind goes to. It feels very fantastical. It feels very of its time. I wouldn't even say the 80s, of a different time. Even when it came out, it seemed old-timey almost. Hellbound Hellraiser 2 is the movie for me when it comes to Doug Bradley, when it comes to the character of Kirsty Cotton, and I absolutely love Ashley Lawrence in this movie. I love everything about this movie, and I'm still waiting for a Hellraiser movie to really capture what Hellbound did. Before I give you guys my last one, I'd be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to Evil Dead 2 from 1987. I absolutely love that movie. Sometimes I just get on rants and I have brain farts, and I had a brain fart when covering 1987. Having said that, I still would have gone The Lost Boys simply for the nostalgia, but Evil Dead 2 is a freaking all-timer. You guys know how much I love that movie. But now we've reached 1989, and this was a difficult year, because you guys know I have a very soft spot in my heart for Halloween 5, The Revenge of Michael Myers. Having said that, I gotta be objective here. It's Pet Sematary. Pet Sematary, just like Hellbound, it's right up there as my favorite of the decade. It might actually be. I don't know. Now that I'm thinking about it, I'm like, which one would I prefer? I'd probably still go Hellbound because Pet Sematary is a hard watch for me nowadays. Obviously, being a dad, I've talked about this story many times. My kid looks like Gage in a lot of ways, so it's like, man, it really resonates with me deeply on a personal level. And having said all of that, it's just truly an effective movie in all the scares, everything it's trying to achieve, it achieves in spades. I cannot tell you how much I love this movie. I think this may be my favorite Stephen King adaptation, period. Like, I love this universe. It's why I was so bummed with Pet Sematary Bloodlines, because anytime you get something Pet Sematary, I'm all for it. And that movie just sucked and was not worthy of this series. So Pet Sematary is going to round out the 80s for me. But I want to hear down below what your guys' favorites are from each year of this decade. Comment them. Tell me why. Tell me why I'm wrong. Anything and everything down below in the comment section. Just so long as you're commenting, I'm happy. Leave a like on this video. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. This is Nick at the Lost River Drive-In. And next up, we're doing the 1990s, so stick around. But until then, I'm pulling out.